Yeah. All right. Well, looks like we're live. So welcome to our viewing audience. My name is Jeff Van Treese, Dr. Jeff Van Treese, and Dr. Mindy Koch. We are Mindy is the president of the Democratic Club of Boca Delray, and this will be our first live stream that we're doing for the to talk about issues. It's called Blue Wave. We're here to talk about issues that are related to the Democratic Party, the 2020 election, with a focus on local issues here in Palm Beach County and South Florida in general, but also national issues. So Mindy, welcome, and wanted to first start out by asking, what do we think about the convention this past week that just wrapped up yesterday evening? We thought it was really inspirational. It was great to see Kamala Harris, first woman of color ever to be put on a presidential ticket for a major party. But on top of that historical significance, we also think that, at least I think that she was a really great pick. I think that this is a great combination to defeat Donald Trump in the November election. And so what do you think about that, Mindy?
I think it was a fabulous convention. It was inspirational. I think it was, after the first night where they had a few production issues, it was really extraordinary. I loved the roll call of the states. I thought that was fabulous. And I got to see all over the country, and there are places now I have to go because I saw them all, and I have to have calamari in Rhode Island.
Yes.
And I think the speeches were fantastic. One built on the next. I just thought it was great. A great showcase of what the Democratic Party really is. We are inclusive. We are diverse. We try to even include Republicans. So listen.
Yeah, I thought Kasich did a pretty good job, and there's going to be a number. Well, we're actually hopefully going to be getting a lot of independent and Republican votes here. And this state, in Florida, it's so important here. We're the biggest battleground state. Essentially, if Trump loses Florida, he would have to, in order to win the election, he'd have to win all of the other all of the other swing states. So it's absolutely critical that the Democrats flip Florida blue this year. And so we've been involved in a lot of trying to get out the vote, especially encouraging vote by mail. This is something that our president has gone out of his way. He is a Palm Beach County resident, as a matter of fact. He's gone way out of his way in an attempt to sabotage or kneecap, as President Obama says, the post office in an attempt to make it more difficult for people to vote by mail. And of course, during this pandemic, everyone is really, really worried about going out in person, about exposing themselves to risk if there's long lines. And so the post office and operating in a functional manner is more important now than it's ever been. And it's really critical that we get the vote out, get people to vote by mail as much as possible, especially those people that are elderly or have underlying conditions where it would not be safe for them to vote in person.
Well, they've really taken voter suppression up another notch. They used to just purge voter files, and then when you got to the polls, you couldn't vote. But now they figured out a way to not deliver our ballots, except I don't think it's going to work. I think everybody, once you get your ballot, you need to just return it. Or if you live in the state of Florida, which everybody here does, you can return it to any early voting location. Or you can take it to your supervisor of elections office. That's at 505 Congress Avenue in Delray Beach. Or you could bring it to my house and I'll take it over for you.
And so there's multiple ways. And so one of the things a lot of people don't know is that you can take your absentee ballot if you're afraid of it getting lost in the mail or not getting there on time or whatever the case might be. Not something likely to happen, but if you are worried about that, you can just drop it off at an early voting site and you don't have to go in. They're going to have drop boxes outside. Everyone can drop their ballots in those drop boxes and be able to vote securely that way. So there's
Correct.
lots of ways that people can vote. And I think that voting early is something that we're going to see through absentee voting and or what we call vote by mail. There really is no difference. There's been a lot of talk about that there's a difference between the two. In Florida, certainly, and in most states, there's no difference. So basically, if you request an absentee ballot or vote by mail, you get a ballot, whether the same thing. So you don't have, and so what Trump is saying, what is that you should have to provide some reason or an excuse as to why you can't vote in person and why you need your absentee ballot. That has never been done in modern history. We've had absentee ballots since the Civil War, essentially, and people have been able to vote for any reason or no reason. If you want to vote by mail, you vote by mail, and it's not as though you have to show proof that you're not going to be able to vote in person. And besides, we shouldn't want people to vote in person during a pandemic. That's not what we want. We don't want long lines. We want people to be able to vote safely from their homes and to reduce the risk that would be on poll workers and everyone else that would be there that would be associated with long lines. We saw what happened when there were long lines in Wisconsin, and the Supreme Court of the United States blocked an extension of the voting deadline. And They had long lines. They had outbreaks from those lines. Our numbers right now are much, much worse than they were in Wisconsin in March, and they had outbreaks then. So we can only imagine what would happen if we had long lines here. And so the president is very aware of that, and he is trying to make it as difficult and as dangerous for people to vote as possible, especially here for example, in Florida, although I think it's backfired. I think it's backfired because now he's told his own constituents not to trust the mail, and Democrats aren't really listening to him, but his own constituents are. So now he's trying to say that absentee voting is okay, but vote by mail isn't. And it's just led to a lot of confusion for people that are listening to him. But of course, if you recognize that what he's saying is not legitimate or serious, then you just do what we do. You disregard it and vote by mail as others would. Right.
But I will tell you that when I was poll watching this week, was at Boynton High. They have three precincts there, and I was protecting the vote for the Democratic Party. And a young man came in, brought his bike and his helmet, and he asked what the difference was between vote by mail and absentee ballots. And fortunately, the clerk there knew the answer, that there is no difference. Now, in Florida, we have no excuse vote by mail. A lot of states, there are about 10 or 12, maybe 14 states that have vote by mail. You have to have an excuse. And in Alabama, you either have to have a witness for your signature or you have to have your signature notarized. They do anything to stop people from voting, but not during the COVID period, not during the pandemic. They're allowing people to just vote by mail.
So we'll see. What are some of the numbers that we've seen here in our primary? They're pretty encouraging as far as they're pretty.
Vote by mail people?
The vote by mail, yes. Okay. And we're probably going to be seeing similar numbers. There'll be a preview of what we see in the general election.
Right now, there are 2.1 million Democrats registered to vote by mail. We have a 689,000 vote by mail margin over the Republicans, which is remarkable. There are also 934,000 no party or other party vote by mail registrants as well, which is amazing. Now here in Palm Beach County, there are going to be pretty soon, in a minute, right now there's 199,712 Democratic vote by mail requests. Like probably tomorrow, there will be 200,000, which is remarkable. 200,000 vote by mail requests here in Palm Beach County. We had more vote by mails returned than any other county in the state. And our margin over Republicans in the vote by mail category is 121,000, almost 122,000. It's remarkable.
It's going to be if what happened, if the primary is any indication of what's going to happen in November, things are looking good. There's reason to be optimistic, but of course, we still have to encourage people to vote early, and to get their ballots in as quickly as possible in case there is some type of last minute coup that is an attempt to block the post office from doing their job. So we still got to encourage people to do that.
Now, I will also tell you, this is a really cool number. 117,804 Democrats in Palm Beach County voted by mail in the last election. Only 38,039 Republicans voted in the list. So that's a 79,000 vote margin. And that margin held because Democrats won pretty well down, although, there were it was a primary, but, democratically supported constitutional officers and those kinds of people won in their elections. So.
We think that the biggest issue on anybody's mind, and we've been watching it, certainly here in Florida, the biggest issue on everybody's mind is the pandemic. We are one of the worst hotspots in the whole world right now. Our numbers are very high, and we had a pretty horrific summer. We've seen over 10,000 deaths here in Florida out of the 170 plus thousand deaths that this country has experienced. And that it's going to be almost impossible for the president or other Republicans to disentangle themselves from the consequences of the very, very atrocious leadership that we've seen from them on this issue. When we saw our own Governor DeSantis essentially mocking the thought that we would need to take precautions back in May, saying that the virus hadn't hit us yet, we wouldn't become Italy. And then, of course, in the following months of June and July, and now in August, we've become one of the worst epicenters in the world for COVID. And we have a very substantial elderly population that's very vulnerable here. And to show that level of callousness to Floridians was pretty bad. And so he's not up for election, but I think everybody, certainly the swing voters in our state, can see the connection between Trump, DeSantis, and the policies that have been enacted by local governments and the pressure that's been put on DeSantis to essentially open our economy prematurely. And there's also, if you look at Biden's plan, as far as reopening is concerned, in terms of reopening safely, there's a huge distinction in terms of just reopening with no mitigation of any kind. That is what we've seen here. We've seen for example, just recently, they're now shutting down bars that were open past 11 p.m. at night, and that just happened within the last few weeks. And that's an example of having large gatherings, large numbers of people in a place that would guarantee that it would spread, which is restaurants, bars, and other large gatherings, and that there hasn't been any real attempt by our leadership to stop that. And that's going to be connected to Trump.
And and the fact is that the economy won't work unless the kids are in school, because teachers, I guess, have become babysitters. Although I guess during the time they have the children, they wind up doing things besides babysitting, which is very fortunate for the children. But when the economy can't open, if people can't go back to work. So it's in their best interest to get control of this as quickly as they can. And I can't figure out why they can't do that. And
other countries have done that. I think when we heard Trump say that there was a spike in New Zealand, that spike was 6 people. So they've managed to get it under control in most of the industrialized world, and even second and third world countries have done a better job. We have 4% of the world's population and 20% of the COVID cases. So even though we are by far the richest superpower on the planet, we've been totally inept at getting this virus under control. And I think it comes from a few things, but I think that this idea that's encouraged by this populist Republican establishment is that you as a citizen, you're being infringed upon if you're being asked to wear a mask. Even been suggested by our vice president that violates your First Amendment right to go out in public and spew respiratory droplets over many people. That is something that you have by virtue of your First Amendment right of freedom of speech. And not only is that wrong, it's also really dangerous. It's really dangerous to be saying that, as well as downplaying the virus in general, because what we're seeing now is that there are many long-term effects that are associated with becoming infected. So it's not just infection or death. It's not just survival or death. There's a lot in between the two where people can have long-term effects from COVID. So the ultimate consequence of our leaders' ineptitude is going to not be seen for years to come, because yes, we have the death toll, but we don't know what all of the long-term health effects will be on our citizens. Another thing that I think is just worth pointing out here, as we now go in and we'll be listening to the Republican convention this week, is that the Republicans have historically been against health care for all, either Medicare for all or Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, or any other act that would expand health care to more of the country's citizens on the basis that there's a limited number of doctors, there's a limited amount of healthcare resources. And then to see how they've squandered it so badly, like a drunken sailor over these past 6 months, our healthcare resources have been absolutely wasted in the worst way possible. And in fact, it's led to the death not only of many citizens, but also many healthcare workers as well. So I think that's going to be front and center. I just don't think there's any way they can disassociate or disentangle themselves from this. We notice how a lot of it seems like the Republicans in Congress or in other positions, either if they don't take a stance against Trump, like Kasich and Mitt Romney, they're either silent, or to the extent that they're trying to defend him, they do such a lukewarm job of it. I don't see how, when Trump is gone, or assuming that he's voted out, how they're going to be perceived by the voting public after that. That's largely an unknown. Will the voters' memories be so short that they don't remember when people like Marco Rubio were defending Trump, or will it be long enough that when it comes time for these people to be up for election, that they'll be held to account as well?
People like they say people don't get engaged until September, but I think certainly the women of the country have been engaged since Donald Trump was elected, because the Women's March in Washington, D.C. was enormous, and in New York and in Florida and in New Jersey and Alabama, all over the world, actually. So I think many people are still engaged. They're watching what's happening, and they will remember in November of 2022 what Marco Rubio did, and his votes against healthcare, and his messianic posts on his Twitter account, and all of those kinds of things. That really hasn't helped the people of the state of Florida very much that I have seen.
I think that I agree with that, and I would say that I think that a lot of it is just a lack of courage, a lack of leadership from a lot of these congressional Republicans and other state and local Republicans that are so afraid of Trump's base that they're afraid that that what's going to happen to them is what happened to Jeff Sessions, that they're going to be canceled by the Republican base because Trump will turn on them. And so we saw that earlier this year with the Senate refusing to hear evidence in the impeachment trial. And we've just kind of seen these Republicans just go blindly because they're so afraid of Trump's base. So this is really quite frightening in terms of our republic being threatened by this populism, or this concept of whatever Trump says, whatever his supporters say, that's what has to be supported no matter what, even if it clearly violates the most fundamental aspects of our Constitution, things like separation of powers, which is something that we all learn it in school and then often forget about it, but it's a really important concept that you have multiple branches of government. Each one is supposed to hold the other to account. And so if you have other branches of government, the legislature, and hopefully not the judiciary, that just act as arms of the executive, then that's ultimately leading its way towards such an expansion of executive power that it's led to the constitutional crises that we've had over the past few years, and what we're now ultimately the consequence of which is what we're seeing during this pandemic, where so much power is now vested in the presidency that we don't really have any meaningful check on it.
I absolutely agree. And, I heard, talk about the Republican convention, I heard this morning that Mitch McConnell is going to be way too busy to go to the Republican convention.
Mm-hmm. Right.
It's just amazing to me. Imagine Chuck Schumer saying, sorry, I'm busy, I'm not coming to the Democratic. I mean, he's the Democratic leader of the Senate. How can you have a convention without your leadership? It was just amazing. I was shocked when wait a minute, what do you mean he's not coming?
I think we're going to be seeing more of this because the Republicans are now realizing that they might be on the Titanic and they're going to try to get on a lifeboat as soon as possible. And so that's what I think we're going to be seeing more of in the coming months. Now, we don't know. I don't
think it's going to work. Do you?
No, it definitely won't work. They've become too entangled with him, and they're going to be associated with him to such an extent that we don't know what's going to happen after that, as far as if they're going to try to reinvent themselves or distance themselves, or just try to just rely on people having short memories and not remembering what happened. But that's going to be hard to do because when you have a death toll at this level, and you're going to have lots of people that have long-term health effects, it's not going to be something that you can just forget was the direct result of Donald Trump and his continuous malfeasance and lies and silencing the healthcare experts and everything else that he's done to make this problem so bad. But turning, fortunately, there is some power that still exists with our local elected leadership. And so one of the things that Trump's lapdog, Governor Ron DeSantis, tried to do in Florida is he issued an executive order that schools had to reopen at full capacity, and that would be done regardless of whether adequate social distancing and PPE and other measures were available to prevent transmission. And that's currently being challenged in court right now. But some of our school districts have reopened, some haven't. And so a lot of this depends on whether the counties decide that we're going into phase 2 versus if we're going to stay in phase 1. Phase 2 it's sort of an artificial designation that the CDC came up with to say that you have low enough transmission over a sustained period of time that now it's safe to reopen schools. But we've seen that that's been tried in other parts of the country, and there's been a lot of transmission and a lot of spread. So right now what we're dealing with, especially here in South Florida, is the counties are trying to figure out if they're going to reopen the schools, and that is now balancing a number of issues. It's really childcare versus safety. That seems to be those are the competing interests going on. Of course, childcare that's unsafe, the problem with that should be obvious. But talking about reopening prematurely where it's unsafe, you're essentially, it's not really child care, it's just at that point just babysitting. They're not, or rather it's not education, it's the only concern really is babysitting. And there should be other ways of doing this. There could be creative ways of coming up with childcare, whether maybe it would be tax incentives to give to employers to provide on-site childcare and things of that nature. But opening the schools, you think about what a school is. Essentially like a petri dish. It's a huge, it's just a place where you can have huge amounts of transmission because you have lots of kids that are crammed together in a very congested place, like a school, where you have hallways and kids bumping into each other, walking near each other. And to say just open up at full capacity, that is something that where our numbers, which are still very high here in South Florida, is going to be a problem. We look to in Central Florida and Northern Florida and other parts of the country, they've reopened, and there have been lots of cases, and there really is.
They close.
And then they close. And one of the things that I think we have to remember about this virus, right, whether we're talking about decisions made at the national level or made at the local level, is that there's certain scientific truths that are true whether you believe it or not. And so it's like arguing against this, against saying that the virus, if you put the kids into an enclosed space, saying that it won't spread or that they're immune, those things are just wrong. It doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. And so it's kind of like gravity. Gravity is something that is present whether you believe it or not. You don't need to believe it in order for it to be true. And so when it comes to the spread of COVID, it's very contagious, and it's going to spread whether or not we're concerned about it, whether or not you have people that want to take the risk or not take the risk. So it's something that we have to recognize, that science and the what we know about this virus is that it's going to spread regardless of what we believe in. So we have crazy leaders, people in the Senate that say that wearing a mask is unnecessary. We have our president saying children are immune and don't spread it, despite the fact that we know that's not true. And you can't just wish it away. You can't wish these problems away. And by reopening schools prematurely, it's going to result in a lot of people dying.
Well, when you look at, first of all, when I started to teach, the Kleenex was, of course, on my desk. And so when they sneezed, they made sure they were sneezing on me, which was not real wise. Then I moved it way back to the back, and that's where the Kleenex is. It's not too convenient for me, but, I'll walk to the back to get a Kleenex. The other thing is, we send children home when they have head lice because it's up to all of the other children in the classroom. We send children home when they have pink eye. Mm-hmm. Can't control the flu. There are so many things we have no control over inside a school setting. Of course, people don't believe that the flu will kill you, although there's about 40,000 deaths a year from the regular flu, the H1N1 or whichever one it is this year. I was at Publix the other day and they said, get your flu shot. I said, oh my God, I have to get my flu shot. So get your flu shot, because you don't really need to risk that too. So, but the children being all in one place and sneezing and waving and then wiping it on you and wanting to hold your hand, they're so sweet, but no. The other thing it'll be interesting how they execute this and how long it lasts, because I have a feeling that it's just going to start to spread like wildfire. And although, social things are very important in school, we have taken our focus off of social, even in the kindergarten, where we insist they must learn the letters and their sounds. And they no longer have play corners and sand tables and water tables and things like that. So the social element that we used to have inside of a school doesn't exist. Everything, the old book, everything I needed to know in life I learned in kindergarten no longer applies. So, I guess they need the socials, to be with their friends, and I do appreciate that. But, if parents feel the need, they can have them play in the neighborhood. And although online classes is not ideal, and certainly special ed suffers from the children in special ed suffer when they are online, because they don't get that one-on-one kind of rewards and things they need. But, we should be able to accommodate that. We're college educators, some of whom have been in the business for 20, 25 years. To make this switch should be not as difficult as everybody seems to be making it. But so the county commission next week is going to hold a meeting whether or not to move to phase 2. So I've already written my county commissioners and told them I didn't think it was a good idea based on the data.
Well, as I didn't mention earlier that you're a retired teacher. I'm currently a teacher, and we've been dealing with, we had online at the end of last school year, and we're getting ready to start online now, like much of the country. And it's not ideal, but it's better than nothing, and it does work for those students that have internet access and have the resources to get online, have Wi-Fi that's reliable. And so a lot needs to be done in that area. But assuming you have all those things, it is a kind of the best we have right now, where we're not going to have lots of transmission. So it's not ideal, but nobody dies from it. And that's where you kind of have to have a balancing act of those two things. As far as the social aspect of it, it's kind of, because we have this, what we're trying to encourage is social distancing, which is where people are not socializing and coming close together. Yet the reason that's been justified to open the schools is to say that they need to be socializing or coming together, which is exactly what will result in transmission. So you have these competing interests, and there's a lot of discussion that has been offered by the governor, for example, that the effect of keeping kids out of school is worse than the death and the destruction that will be caused by the transmission that will result if they go back to school. Of course, he doesn't know that, and you can. The main thing that they're concerned about is people being out of work, right? So people being out of work, businesses going out of business. The difference is those are things that you can rebuild, right? You can rebuild businesses. You can hopefully get people that have lost their job either to receive unemployment or to get alternative employment where it's safe for them to work. So if somebody's working in a place like a restaurant, hopefully they can be doing other things perhaps the Biden plan could help put people to work, as for example, contract tracers and other things like that we desperately need, as opposed to being employed in places that are likely to cause transmission. So there's a lot of failed leadership, both in terms of how we're dealing with kids as well as how we're dealing with adults. But ultimately, what we do know from the experts is that reducing the gathering of people together in an enclosed space is what we have to stop. That's the only way. And if we did that for even
the only way to control it, right?
That's the only way to control it. It was the only way to control it in 1918. It's the only way to control it in 2020. There is no better way to control the spread of a respiratory virus than to keep people from coming together where they can inhale respiratory droplets from other people. And right. That's just a fact. There's no denying it. You can't talk your way around it, and you can't wish it away. And so it's really tough medicine, to quote Bill Gates. It's tough medicine to take that we have to be distant like this. But if we just buckle down and do it, which we haven't done here, we open prematurely, and the cost of opening prematurely basically threw in the garbage everything that we had done in March, April, and May. But if we did this for a period of 6 to 8 weeks, we could really get this under control and could talk about reopening schools in stages. But that's not the route that our leadership is going. Instead, it's open it all at once, have massive transmission and massive death, and just deal with it. Not to mention that our Florida Constitution guarantees that schools are to be, quote, safe, unquote. So how you can call this safe is really a stretch. And this is something that is, I hate to think of it like this, but hopefully teachers won't have to individually threaten not to come to work. It shouldn't come to that. It should be something that our leaders are able to keep us safe as teachers. So we'll see. But there's a lot of things that are up in the air right now, and that's why it's really important as citizens that we make our leadership know that we are civically engaged with the process.
Right. And I might have just made this up. It might be a combination of different pieces of information. Nobody told me to this, but I did hear, I think, that in Martin County, 79 teachers have either quit or retired.
That's a large number.
You can't open a school if you don't have any teachers.
Right, you can't. And there's other parts of the country that have there's been large enough numbers that they essentially had to go back online. Like in Georgia, there's some school districts that just had to go from in-person back to online because there just weren't enough teachers willing to come back in person. Plus, there's as far as how there's no real guidance in terms of how we would do it. And so what it seems like everyone's kind of passing the buck to somebody else to say, well, you figure it out. And that we have no plan that really needs to come from the national level and then be implemented at the state level.
And here's the other thing, we have all these schools in Palm Beach County. Very few are walking distance from your house. If you live across the street from Spady Elementary in Delray, you can certainly walk to school. If you live, east of 95 and west of Swinton, you can walk to Spady Elementary. However, most of our kids go on buses. The buses hold about 54 children. That's 3 children to a seat. And they would need 6 buses to run the route if you wanted to have safe social distancing. And I was told, no, we're not doing that. So all the kids, if you have, barriers set up in classrooms and face masks on and all those things, you're going to have 3 children sitting in every seat on the school bus. And because there's no other way for them to get to school, they have to ride the bus. And so that's a real problem, I think. And most parents who are going to work can't drop their children off at school. They'll be late for work. Then they'll get fired. So
and this is one of
people maybe need to start to think outside the box in an unconventional way, but so far nobody has been able to accomplish that.
And I think, and if you look at all of these, there's so many nuances in terms of how a school works, where students and staff and faculty are coming into contact with each other that have not been thought of when people say reopen schools. So the busing issue is one of those. How is that going to work? How do you socially distance on a bus? There's been no suggestion as far as, like you said, tripling or quadrupling the number of buses that are running, and nobody's proposing that. Also, we'd have to deal, it's very difficult to get adults to wear masks. If you go into any, I've certainly gone into a number of big box stores and seen adults without masks. So
or masks below their nose, which I like.
Mask below their nose. Yeah. I've seen a lot of people that have the mask below their nose. So how do you deal with that? How do you deal with those people, with kids that are like that? Remember, you're essentially their legal, you are their legal guardian at a school. The school is their legal guardian while they're at the school. So can you send them out of the school? Because what are you going to do? You're going to take them all and put them in one room, put them in a in-school suspension if they don't have a mask or won't wear their mask. So how's that going to be dealt with? How's that going to work? Are you going to throw them outside on the street? Well, who knows? You can't really do that because you're their legal guardian.
Are teachers allowed to say they can't come in without masks?
Right. And
that, I haven't heard anybody say, you could do that. No, you probably can't do that. It's probably, you either wear a mask or you don't wear a mask and you get to come to class anyway. So it's just what is amazing to me is that we can't get agreement on what appears to me to be a very simple solution. Social distancing and wearing masks. I mean, in Japan, they didn't have the kind of outbreak they had all over, or Korea, the kinds of outbreaks they had all over the world, because when the H1N1 came in the 90s, or the swine flu, or whatever it was they were
The early 2000s when they had COVID.
They wore masks.
SARS, the first SARS.
SARS 1, right? That's
one.
the one. And they all said, "Okay, we can solve this problem. Let's wear masks." And so it worked. There's empirical evidence that it works. And
I think a lot of that.
People say no, it doesn't work.
I think a lot of that also has a cultural component to it, and so to the extent that you have this right-wing propaganda that the government is this foreign agent that you should always reject, always be suspicious of if it is putting in any type of regulation or any type of restriction, that is something that can really be dangerous, because you have public health, which means that one person's behavior influences another person. You can't divorce or separate one person's behavior from the welfare of someone else, and that's certainly true during a pandemic. And so, to the extent that you have any obligation towards your community or towards other human beings, is largely rejected by these anti-maskers and other conspiracy theorists that we see come up, and it becomes very difficult. It becomes very difficult to even talk to these people, and so. With that,
so they're protesting about the restaurant that says no shirt, no shoes, no food.
Right. They're not doing that, but they're doing this because this is in their mind some kind of restriction on their freedom that they're entitled.
Well, no shirt, no shoes, no food is a restriction from the health department. That's a requirement of the health department.
Right.
So I can't, people talk about seatbelts and all, but it took 10 years to convince people to wear seatbelts until they started in cars. And if you didn't put it on, it just kept beeping until people started to detach them. And then they, anyway, but most wear seatbelts, right?
Well, the seatbelt example is the mask is even much stronger than the seatbelt. The seatbelt only affects you. In other words, if
Correct.
you
That's
are
true.
next to a seatbelt, but the mask, wearing a mask, it affects anyone that you come in contact with. And so how is this going to work with 5 and 6 year olds that either don't put their mask on right, or don't put it on, or it falls off?
Or they're 5 or 6 years old.
Right. So how is that going to work? And we haven't heard any answers from our leadership other than to say that once we hit phase 2, the schools are opening. But we don't know how any of these problems are going to be dealt with that come up, and it's going to be essentially left to individuals to make these decisions that are on the ground, and that's not the way you're supposed to do it.
And I have to add that the universities that have opened, they planned it very carefully. They cut the size of classes. They social distance every class. Right. They changed the amount of students in a dorm room. They changed the food plan. You have to make a reservation at the cafeteria to go eat. Mm-hmm. The library has only 2 chairs at the table instead of 5 or 6 or whatever. And guess what? It still didn't work.
Mm-hmm. And if that didn't work, how is it going to work at a high school that has 3,000, 3,500 students that have 2 lunches? That means that at any given time, you're going to have 12, 13, 1,400 kids either in a cafeteria or in a courtyard that are not going to be socially distanced at all, because that's impossible to do. And they're going to be eating where, when you're eating, the food is going to be contaminated by respiratory droplets. It's just there's no one has answered for that. No one has answered for these concerns other than just say reopen. The kids are immune. They're going to get sick and kill a bunch of people. We don't know how many, but people need to get back to work. So that's our solution to that problem. That's not an answer, and that's not something that we should find as acceptable. Whether we have school-age kids or not, it's going to affect all of us, because you can't say that it's like being in a lifeboat. If you're in a lifeboat, I can't poke a hole on one side of the lifeboat and say, well, that's my side, that's not your side. We're all in this together, because if the transmission goes way up, it's going to make it much more likely that you or someone you love is going to become infected. So this is something we should all care about. And to that end, what are some of the things we can do? We can email, write, or call our local
county commissioners.
Yes. So that's something that
Their email addresses are their first letter of their first name and their last name spelled out at pbcgov.org.
And that's in Palm Beach County. If
That's
you're
in Palm
listening
Beach County.
if you're listening to this elsewhere, you can look up your own county commissioners and email them that. And one of the things that I like to do when I'm reaching out to people that are in a position of power, instead of necessarily, in addition to saying what I think, I often like to ask some questions. So I would encourage you to ask those questions that we're talking about now. How do you plan on dealing with these scenarios? They should have to answer those questions. And certainly before they make any decisions, they should have to address how those are going to be dealt with. So that's something we encourage everyone to do. So with that, I think we're probably out of time for today, or we're going to conclude. Was there any other anything else you'd like to add, Mindy?
No, I'm good.
I think we covered everything going on. So we'll watch the Republican convention and also watch very closely what's going on with our reopening. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you next time. In broadcast.